Thank you so much, Anthony. The next speaker we have another fabulous speaker from the AIC. This time we've got Heather Wolbers.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah. Oh, there we go. So today I want to talk about the first piece of research that has emerged from this big body of work that the AIC are undertaking about dating apps and the harms that occur on dating apps. This one looks at the sexual harassment, aggression and violence victimization among mobile dating platform users in Australia. So it probably comes as no surprise that dating apps are incredibly popular. I'm sure everyone here has a friend who's used one, or maybe you've used one yourself. A survey was conducted in 2021 that found that 3.2 million Australians were on dating apps. Most users were kind of a bit younger, 25 to 34, kind of in that dating pool. And surprisingly, it has become one of the most common ways of meeting a new partner. So it's overtaken these more traditional methods of meeting through friends, meeting at uni, meeting at a bar. It also comes as no surprise that it is a very effective way of meeting a long-term partner. So I've been invited to 3 weddings next month, and all 3 met on a dating platform. My sister met her husband on Bumble. But it's probably also not surprising that there is some bad stuff happening on these online dating platforms. So these are just a few news articles and clippings that are very easy to come across. These were all kind of emerging over the last few years, and discussions were starting to happen about what was happening and concerns about sexual harassment, aggression and violence occurring on these dating platforms, and some empirical research was starting to emerge. But what was really lacking was a really good understanding of the prevalence of this crime. So is it just a few bad apples, or is this a more widespread problem? And also what was lacking was kind of this more in-depth understanding of exactly what was occurring, how common each behaviour is, and the variety of harms being perpetrated on these platforms. So the AIC in 2021 set out to do a very large national survey of dating platform users, and we used Roy Morgan, which is a market research company, to recruit for the study. It started off, we did a kind of like a pilot survey of sorts to calibrate the quotas, because we're using a proportional quota sampling approach. And the quotas were based on gender, age, and where people were living. And we adjusted the quotas for the propensity to use a mobile dating platform. So once we removed the erroneous responses, we ended up with a sample of just under 10,000 people. And you can see the target population is skewing a lot younger than the Australian population, and this is just because it is representative of mobile dating app users, not representative of the Australian population. So the sample was fairly evenly dispersed over Australia in terms of population density, so you can see a lot of the sample were coming from these eastern states. We had about 50% males and 50% females, and around 15% of the sample identified as LGB+, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, or another non-heterosexual sexual identity. And we had 0.7% of the sample who identified as a non-binary gender. So also we had 7.8% of the sample identifying as First Nations. Around 12% said that they had a restrictive health condition. 8.6% were from a non-English speaking background, and about 20% were from a regional or remote area of Australia. The survey asked about a lot of different things, so of course socio-demographic characteristics. We asked people about how they were using dating platforms, so their frequency of use, how many platforms they were on at once, things like that. And then we asked about these 3 kind of domains of harm that people might be experiencing, so sexual harassment, aggression and violence, both experiences online and in person, being sent requests to facilitate child sexual exploitation, and attempts to recruit people on dating apps into exploitative conditions, so human trafficking and modern slavery. And finally, for people who had experienced sexual harassment, aggression and violence, we asked them whether they had reported that behaviour to the police or to the dating app, and just to understand those experiences of reporting. So of course, this first paper that I'm discussing is just focusing on this very first kind of harm. So just very briefly, the limitations of the data. So we didn't ask any questions on perpetration, just for a number of reasons. This was a victim-centered survey, so we can't really comment on who the perpetrators were, their socio-demographics, or anything like that. We also can't link victimization to any specific apps or websites. We did ask people what apps they were using, but it's difficult to link that to the behaviors that they had experienced because people were on multiple apps, and then it would be a lot of follow-up questions. And also the exploration of victimization experiences. It is broken down by the gender and sexual identities of respondents throughout. However, we weren't able to collect information on transgendered identities, so that's just a limitation of the findings. So in total, we asked about 22 different behaviors that people may have experienced, and cumulatively, these, we're calling it dating app facilitated sexual violence. So the online behaviors that people had experienced, there were 14 that we had asked about, and these fell kind of broadly into these 4 categories. So online sexual harassment, abusive and threatening language, online image-based sexual abuse, and online stalking, which was things like being pressured to share your location. And then the in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence were things that have happened when someone had met up with a person that they had connected with through a dating app. This was sexual assault and coercion, reproductive and sexual health-related abuse, which are things like stealthing or lying about your sexual health status. In-person image-based sexual abuse and in-person stalking, which looks at someone showing up inappropriately, loitering. And all of these behaviors, we did focus on things that had happened in the previous 5 years. So looking first at the online dating app facilitated sexual violence, overall 72.3% of the sample, or around 3 in 4, said that they had experienced something online in the last 5 years. And looking closer at the 4 different categories, around 69% said that they had been sexually harassed. 45% had been subjected to abusive and threatening language. Just over a quarter had been stalked online. And almost 20% said that somebody had subjected them to online image-based sexual abuse. When we break this down by the gender and sexual identities of respondents, you can see we are seeing a bit of a different story. So you can see here the LGB plus females experienced the highest prevalence of online dating app facilitated sexual violence. And this was followed closely by the non-binary respondents, and then the LGB plus males and heterosexual females. And I mean, while the heterosexual males experienced the lowest prevalence, you can see it's still 60%, which is a very high rate of harm. So what we did next is that we summed together all of the behaviors. So again, we asked about 14 different behaviors, so we added these together just to see the variety, how many behaviors people were experiencing. And here we can see that 60.8% of respondents said that they had experienced multiple types of online dating app facilitated sexual violence. So the overall average for the full sample was 4 of these behaviors. However, when we break it down by the gender and sexual identity, again, we are seeing a bit of a different story. So the LGB plus females, the non-binary respondents, they were experiencing on average more of these online behaviors. For the in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, unfortunately, over a third of the sample had been subjected to at least one form of in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence in the previous 5 years. And looking closer at those 4 categories, so over a quarter had been sexually assaulted or coerced. Almost 20% had been subjected to the reproductive and sexual health-related abuse. 14% had been stalked in person, and 10% had been subjected to in-person image-based sexual abuse. So you can see there's very high prevalences, very concerning, especially considering the long-term impacts of these kinds of experiences. So looking closer at the sexual assault and coercion item, there were 4 behaviors that we had asked about that fell into that category. So for each of the behaviours that we did ask about, we questioned whether one person had perpetrated that against them or multiple people, so separate occasions with multiple perpetrators. And for this example here, 10% of respondents said that somebody had attempted to engage in a sex act when they couldn't consent, and 5% said that multiple people had done this to them. And this was a fairly consistent story across all of the 22 behaviours, where the majority had said that one person had done it, but still quite a sizable proportion said that multiple people had done this, so they're experiencing the same behaviours repeatedly. So when we look at the overall prevalence of in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence broken down by the gender and sexual identity of respondents, again, we are seeing quite a different story than the overall prevalence. So the female LGB plus respondents, almost half of them had experienced something in person when meeting up with someone from a dating app. And this was closely followed by the LGB plus males and the non-binary respondents. And again, while the heterosexual males experienced it the least prevalently, it's still over a quarter of heterosexual males on dating apps have had something problematic happen to them in the last 5 years. Something to note is that when we did this with the 4 different categories of in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence, the LGB plus males experienced 3 of those categories most prevalently. And for the 4th category, which was the sexual assault and coercion, that was the LGB plus females experiencing that most prevalently. So that's probably what's driving this highest prevalence overall. Again, we summed together the behaviours. There were 8 in total that we had asked about, and 22.7% said that they had experienced multiple in-person harms facilitated by a dating app. And you can also see here that 6% of the sample said that they experienced 7 or 8 behaviours, so experiencing the full range or a large variety of in-person harms. So while overall the average number of behaviours experienced in person was just over 1, again, when we break it down, we do see that the LGB plus males and females were experiencing, on average, more of these in-person behaviours and harms. So finally, we also looked at how these different behaviours co-occurred. So far we've talked about the online and the in-person as kind of separate, but they did have a very high rate of co-occurring. So this pie chart kind of shows all of the people who had experienced either an online or an in-person act of dating app facilitated sexual violence. And of those people, we see that 44.8% experienced something online as well as in person. So 53.7% experienced only online dating app facilitated sexual violence, and just 1.5% experienced in person only. And this just shows that if you've experienced something in person, you've very likely also experienced online dating app facilitated sexual violence. So just to sum up all of those findings, the report goes into a lot more detail. But for overall, 3 in 4 respondents had experienced online dating app facilitated sexual violence, and 1 in 3 had experienced in-person dating app facilitated sexual violence. These experiences were not isolated or singular, so people were experiencing multiple types of harm. They were experiencing things perpetrated by multiple people, and they were also experiencing things both online and in person. And finally, the LGB plus respondents were reporting the highest rates of dating app facilitated sexual violence, so they appeared to be the most at risk of the people that we examined. So we can do some stuff about this, which is good because the prevalences are very concerning. So since we published the paper, we've been in talks with a lot of different people. Recently, a roundtable was held where there were legislators, people from domestic violence organisations, e-safety, researchers, just a whole bunch of people came together to discuss what we could do about this. And we kind of have these 4 overarching things that we should tackle. So preventing perpetrators from exploiting these dating platforms, supporting people who experience harm, empowering people through providing information about how to stay safe or what to do if something happens, and of course, promoting technological solutions. So on a practical level, some ideas that were floated were identity verification, So I think a few apps are currently doing this where it's an opt-in. You get a little tick if you verify your identity, you link your email or something like that. It's not super widespread or enforced, but I think it's a good way to prevent this perpetrator exploitation because their name is linked to their account. And at the very least, you know who you are talking to is who they say they are. Also, it's important that we ensure that reporting is very accessible and easy to do. If it's very difficult to report, people aren't going to do it. And ensuring that people are reporting is a good way to identify who these perpetrators are and remove them from the platform. And then if they had their identity verified, then we could keep them from signing back up again and again and again. And of course, technological solutions, apps are always updating and changing. I know Tinder recently started incognito mode where you can swipe and only the people that you've swiped right on can see you, which is good for your privacy. But that's only available if you pay for Tinder. Yeah, there's just lots of things, like AI can censor explicit images, and then you can decide whether you want to view that image or not, so it's a good way to prevent that image-based abuse or harassment. So just to finish up, I will shamelessly plug some of the other research that has emerged from this. So we have done a study on the sexual exploitation of children on dating apps, so people are receiving requests about their children that are very problematic. And reporting of the dating app facilitated sexual violence to the police. And there's a lot more work still to come that is very close to coming out. So looking at a few other different populations who are at higher risk, reporting to the dating platforms themselves, and that human trafficking, modern slavery stuff is going to come out soon. So watch this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. That was a fantastic. That's all right.
You can hear me. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering if you asked them about anything that they did in response to the particular incident. So reporting rates, for example, to police, platforms, did they leave the platform, anything like that in terms of their response?
I don't think we asked them if they left the platform afterwards. We asked about some like self-protection behaviours, so how they're operating on dating apps. Unfortunately, we don't have kind of temporal data of whether they were doing that before they were victimised or after, but just based on preliminary analyses, there were very high rates of harmful experiences among people who were using those, which kind of indicates that something had happened and then they employed these strategies to stop it from happening again, so blocking users, deleting their account, things like that. Definitely the reporting, we asked a lot of questions about reporting, just those experiences, whether it was positive, whether they were offered support for that. So there was that paper by Siobhan who goes into that for the police. It was actually somewhat positive of an experience for a lot of people who reported, which was nice to see, kind of surprising. And then the dating app stuff is going to come out soon, how people felt about reporting to the dating app and what those experiences were.
Does it?
Thank you. That was very interesting, particularly the findings around the LGBTQI results. Were there any insights as to why they were higher rates of victims in that group?
So, I mean, the data is somewhat limited in that we don't have information about the context and everything. So, I mean, I would imagine a lot of the factors that make these individuals at higher risk of broader sexual violence would apply as well. What we can say from the data is that LGBT plus people were using dating apps somewhat differently. So they were more frequent dating app users on more platforms. So there could be kind of this opportunity effect at play where they're like more visible or, perhaps targeted because of their sexual identity by catfishing, things like that.
Hey, so you spoke about the roundtable that you had, and just on that note about catfishing, was there any discussion in that roundtable around kind of ongoing perpetration because those accounts are linked to either a mobile address or a mobile number or an email address, and someone can just continue to make fake email addresses and fake accounts over and over again, and how you would stop someone from doing that? Was there conversation around that?
I actually didn't attend the roundtable, but yeah, I feel like the identity verification is really important. I know Japan have rolled that out fully. Everyone on dating apps there is identity verified, so I've heard. I think that really should be bolstered. So not just an email account. So sometimes you link your social media, and again, you can make a fake social media, but it is a bit more difficult than a fake email. But yeah, if we do like government IDs, it might be a better way to stop people from just creating these fake accounts.
I just wondered if cultural identity was the fact that it's explored in the research that you talked about, that is effect of gender identity, and I wondered if there was an interaction with cultural identity.
For this particular paper, we didn't look further beyond sexual and gender identity. So there is in the works a few papers about other things like looking at disability, looking at the intersectionality of different socio-demographic characteristics to see who are most at risk in what certain vulnerable populations. So we didn't look at cultural identity for this one, but I think it's in the works, definitely.
I was interested, just going back to the beginning of your sample size, because those are quite concerning statistics in terms of the proportion of people that have experienced that level of violence. When you collected your sample, did you tell them that it was about violence on dating apps, so that is there any risk that there's a propensity of people who've experienced this who want to be involved in that kind of study because they've got a story to tell? That's really what I was wondering.
I mean, I guess that's the case for any kind of survey research where you have to title the survey so people have some indication of what the survey is going to be about. So it's very possible.
I was wondering, are the platforms, is it difficult for the police to work with them in like releasing data? So when there's a perpetrator identified, are they open to like providing information that they've captured, or is that sort of
To the police?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something that was discussed at the round table, is the information sharing. So I think the bigger dating apps, they obviously have a lot more money, so they are able to implement a lot more of these safety strategies and things like that. So it's definitely something that's discussed. And also, when you report something to a dating app, then they might say, hey, do you want to like report this to the police? I think I'm not on dating apps. I don't know if that's like currently happening, and definitely not across the board. But definitely something that was discussed is, referring people to the appropriate reporting channels.